When you look out your window, you see the June sun still hanging above the horizon. Golden light stretches across the dark waters of the fjord, while you sit on the edge of your bed, trying to close your eyes. But your body refuses to sleep, because in this small northern town in Iceland, the sun hasn't set for 9 weeks. There's no night, no darkness, only an endless daylight. You're starting to forget what time is. Was it yesterday, today, or tomorrow? You no longer know. So what would you have done if you lived in a place where the sun didn't set for months? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which country you're watching from. So today, let's go to Northern Iceland. Chapter 1. The beginning of light. When you made the decision to empty your small apartment in Reykjavik and move to the Safjordur, it was the 10th day of May. The job offer had come unexpectedly because there was an English teacher vacancy at the town's local school, and you wanted to get away from the capital's noise and crowds. This small town, one of the largest settlements in the West Fjords region, stood at Iceland's far northwestern tip, on the edge of the endless Atlantic. When you looked at the map, a handful of houses squeezed between green mountains, a narrow fjord, a few thousand people. It seemed like a perfect escape. But you had no idea yet about those strange summer days awaiting you in the future. The journey had taken 8 hours, because to reach this Safjordur from Reykjavik, you had to pass through winding coastal roads, circle countless fjords. As you looked out the bus window, you noticed the landscape becoming a bit wilder with every kilometer. As you left the capital, traces of civilization diminished, replaced by a world of volcanic rocks, harsh winds, endless green hills. When the clock showed 3 in the afternoon, you had arrived at Ísafjordur's entrance. But the sun was still overhead, as if claiming it was still midday. When you got off the bus, you saw the colorful houses holding the town's 2,600 population. Structures lined up as if climbing steep slopes. Everywhere was silent, but not an eerie silence. More the silence of a place disconnected from the rest of the world, where time had slowed down. The rental apartment where you'd spend your first night was on the 2nd floor of an old wooden building in the town center. The landlady Gudrun was a 60-something, white-haired woman with a warm smile who told you when handing over the keys that you needed to adjust your night's sleep well. At that moment, you didn't understand what this meant, because even though it was 9 in the evening, the sun was still shining. The sky was clear blue. There was no sign of darkness. After unpacking your suitcases and putting away your belongings, when it reached 11 o'clock, you decided to go to bed. But when you drew the curtains, you were shocked. Sunlight was still seeping through the curtains, because the sun hadn't set. It had only lowered a bit. You lay in bed, closed your eyes, but your body refused to sleep because your brain wasn't receiving the night signal. At 3 in the morning, you had gotten up and looked out the window again. The sun was still there, right above the horizon, hanging like a golden sphere. In bewilderment, you decided to go out into the street because you couldn't believe this sight. Walking the town's narrow streets, you encountered a few people. They too were wandering at midnight like you, but no one found it strange. An old man sat on a bench, holding a coffee cup, looking at the fjord. 2 young cyclists passed by you, laughing and talking about something. The supermarket lights were on, the door open. When you went inside, you saw the wall clock showing 03:15, but the store was full. People were shopping. Cashiers were working at the counter. It was as if the concept of time had begun to melt for everyone. The next day, when you started work at school, you met your other colleagues in the teacher's lounge. They had been living here for years, were used to the summer sun. But when they noticed your bewilderment, they laughed. A young math teacher named Christian, taking a sip of his coffee, asked if this was your first summer, and you nodded. He continued, saying the first week was very difficult. Your body would be in shock. When there was no darkness, you wouldn't know when to sleep. He noted that in his first summer here, he slept a total of 10 hours over 3 days. This statement had reassured you a bit, because you understood you weren't alone. Another teacher, Elisabeth, an experienced woman in her 50s, advised you to buy thick curtains, use an eye mask, constantly check your watch. Otherwise, she added, you would lose time. During the first week, your sleep patterns slowly began to shift. Under normal circumstances, you were a person who went to bed at 11 and got up at 7. But now going to bed at 11 had become impossible because outside was bright. The sun was still shining in the sky. Your body was signaling it wasn't night yet. You stayed awake until midnight, then tried to force your eyes closed. You woke at 4 in the morning because sunlight seeped through the curtains, illuminating the room. A few days later, you bought an eye mask, but this time the mask's tightness was uncomfortable. At Christian's suggestion, you bought melatonin supplements from the pharmacy because the sleep hormone your body should naturally secrete wasn't being produced due to the constant sunlight. As you began to get to know the town, you better understood how different a place this was. Isafjordur was at the tip of a peninsula surrounded by steep mountains. 3 sides mountains, 1 side fjord. In winter, these mountains completely blocked the sun because the sun couldn't rise high enough. Gudrun had told you one day. From early November to late January, they couldn't see the sun. It stayed behind the mountains. There would only be a few hours of dim light. When the sun appeared again over the hills at the end of January, the whole town would make pancakes and drink sun coffee. Children wouldn't go to school that day. Everyone would celebrate outside. This story had both surprised and saddened you because you couldn't even imagine what it was like not to see the sun for 2 months. Your first lessons with students had gone quite well because they were eager to learn English, and you loved teaching. But when you returned home after class, you noticed a new, strange situation. When exactly was dinner time? Normally, you would eat dinner when the sun set, but since the sun didn't set here, what time should you eat dinner? You looked at the clock. It showed 6, but outside was bright as noon. You experienced a moment where your stomach couldn't decide what to think, because while your visual perception still said afternoon, the time shown by the clock said evening. This disconnect caused you to understand for the first time how much your relationship with time was dependent on sunlight. When the weekend came, you decided to explore the town more. You went for a walk along the fjord shore, advanced toward the small harbor where fishing boats were anchored. Fishermen were repairing their nets, cleaning their boats. One said something to you in Icelandic you didn't understand, but smiled and nodded. When another asked in English if you were new here, you answered yes. The man, in his 40s, smelling of seaweed, sun-tanned skin, noted that the first summer was always difficult, but you'd get used to it. After saying your body would adapt, he added that it was actually good for fishermen, because they could go out at night too, work more. Then he laughed. You responded with a forced smile. But the phrase, "we can go out at night too," echoed inside you, because there was no night. Only an endless daytime. When you returned home in the evening, or more precisely, when you returned home around 8 o'clock, Gudrun was sitting in front of the door, knitting. You greeted each other, chatted a bit. When she asked how your sleep was, you honestly said you were struggling. Gudrun looked at you sympathetically, saying she too had a very difficult first summer, had come from Reykjavik, was like you. After emphasizing this place was different, very different. She noted that people get used to everything. She said you just had to accept that time wasn't your friend. Time here was uncertain, fluid, and you would learn to flow with it. These words sounded philosophical to you, but didn't really calm you. because the idea of time being uncertain was frightening. When you tried to sleep at night, you tossed and turned in bed. You closed your eyes, but your brain kept working. You thought the human body had evolved according to the night-day cycle for millions of years, sleeping when the sun set, waking when the sun rose, was a natural rhythm. But now, this rhythm didn't exist. The sun never set. So what would the body do? What would the brain do? What would the hormones do? You remembered biology classes you studied in school. Melatonin hormone was secreted when it was dark, brought sleep. But if there was no darkness, there was no melatonin. That's why you needed to use the supplement you bought. But this was an artificial solution, not natural. You didn't know how long your body could endure this. A week later, the first real problem emerged. You started having difficulty understanding whether it was day or night. One morning, when you woke up, you looked out the window. The sun was shining. You looked at the clock. It was 02:30. You thought, was it morning? But no. It was past midnight. You tried to sleep again, but couldn't, because your body was signaling, morning has come. Get up. Then you got up, went to the kitchen, made coffee. You looked at the street from the window. A few people were walking. Had they also stayed sleepless like you? Or were they doing morning exercise? You couldn't understand. When it passed 3 o'clock, you went back to bed, fell asleep at 4:30. The alarm rang at 7:30. You had slept a total of 3 hours. Your eyes were closed all day at school because your head was foggy, your body tired. At lunch, Christian suggested an Icelandic resource written on sleep disorders. Since you couldn't read Icelandic, he explained the English summary. The body's circadian rhythm, meaning biological clock, was regulated most by light. Eyes perceive light, send signals to the brain. The brain would secrete hormones. If there was light, cortisol and adrenaline. If there was darkness, melatonin. But when there was no darkness here, melatonin secretion would decrease. Sleep pattern would be disrupted. As a result, insomnia, fatigue, attention problems, emotional imbalance would appear. While listening to these, you learned that the things you experience had a medical explanation. At least you weren't going crazy. You were just experiencing a natural process. But this knowledge didn't really reassure you either, because the problem still continued. After 10 days passed, one morning, or more precisely when you woke at 4 o'clock, you decided to go out and walk. You wandered the town streets, advanced along the fjord shore. The wind was gentle, the air cool but pleasant. The sun stood just above the horizon, as if it had paused for a moment. Snow sparkled on the mountain peaks because despite it being late May, snow didn't melt at high summits. This landscape was enchanting, but at the same time eerie, because seeing such a landscape at 4 o'clock caused the meaning of time to be lost. You sat on a bench and looked at the fjord. The water was calm, like a mirror. Reflections of mountains stood on the water. At that moment, a thought came to mind. Maybe time really was uncertain. Maybe people had only invented the concepts of night and day to classify time. But nature didn't care about this. The sun behaved as it wished. When you returned home, Gudrun was drinking coffee in the kitchen. It was 5 o'clock. When she asked if you couldn't sleep either, you said yes. Gudrun smiled, saying they were all the same. The first week went like this. Then she noted that the body somehow got used to it, but didn't fully adapt. There was some difficulty every summer. You asked her a question. You were curious what winter was like, what they did when they didn't see the sun for 2 months. Gudrun's face became more serious. She said, "Winter was harder when there was no night. You couldn't sleep. When there was no day, you couldn't wake up. Depression was very common in winter. People took vitamin D, received light therapy, but to no avail. The body wanted the sun. When the sun appeared again at the end of January, it was as if they were reborn. That's why the pancake celebration was important to them. This answer made you think, because living here was difficult not just in one season, but every season. Dark in winter, light in summer. Both were extreme, both challenged people. At the end of the first week, you noticed your concept of time had begun to blur. For example, you remembered it was Thursday, but was it today or yesterday? You weren't sure. The transition from one day to the next wasn't clear, because there was no night. There were only hours with slightly less light. Since you didn't sleep at night, waking up in the morning wasn't clear either. Did you wake up? You woke up. But which morning was this? Monday morning or Tuesday morning? You had to constantly look at the clock, because you couldn't get a clue from the sun. This situation was starting to frighten you, because you were losing control of time. Elisabeth was right. You had to constantly look at your watch, otherwise you would lose time. You were doing exactly that. But this too was tiring, constantly checking the time, constantly trying to remember. When the 14th day came, you would have now spent 2 weeks in Dysafjordur. You were progressing well with your students at school, but you knew the nights were still very difficult. You went to bed, closed your eyes. Hours passed, but you couldn't sleep deeply. You woke frequently, made an effort to fall back asleep. When you got up in the morning, you felt tired, because your sleep quality was low. Your body couldn't rest. Your brain couldn't renew. Your energy was decreasing. When you looked at yourself in the mirror, you noticed there were bruises under your eyes. Your skin was pale. Your facial features had tensed. If this continued at this rate, you were scared thinking what state you'd be in by the end of summer. But there was still hope. Christian had said, after 2 weeks, your body would start to adapt. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be a bit better. You were clinging to this because you had no other choice. You had decided to come here. You would work here. You would live here. Going back wasn't an option. So, you told yourself, you would endure. Everyone was enduring. You would endure too. But in the silence of night, or rather in those strange, bright hours while lying in bed, sometimes you asked yourself, how could a person live in a place like this? In a place where the sun doesn't set, where time is lost? How could a person remain normal? You didn't know the answer, but you would learn. Because summer had just begun. You still had 9 weeks ahead. Chapter 2. The Disappearance of Time. When the 15th day of June came, you would have now spent 5 weeks in Ísafjörður. Your sleep pattern had partially improved because your body had started getting used to the melatonin supplement. But the problem wasn't completely solved. You slept an average of 5 hours each night. This was sufficient, but not ideal. You woke tired in the mornings, experienced energy drops in the afternoons. Your head became foggy in the evenings. Christian had been proven right. The body had adapted, but was far from perfect. The 21st day of June, summer solstice, was the longest day of the year. On this date in Ísafjörður, the sun wouldn't set at all for a full 24 hours. Because the town was very close to the Arctic Circle, the sun would spin just above the horizon. At school, Elisabeth had told you, this night was special. The sun wouldn't set at all. Not at all. Some would celebrate. Some would go for walks to the fjord. Some would just watch. You also decided to watch, because witnessing such a thing was perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime experience. After 10 in the evening, you walked to the fjord shore. The air was cool but pleasant, the wind gentle, the sky clear. The sun stood on the western side, Golden lights sparkled on the water. As 11 passed, the sun slowly descended, but didn't set. When 12 came, meaning officially midnight, the sun was right above the horizon, hanging like a bright red sphere. Then it slowly started rising again. Night didn't come. Night didn't arrive. There was only a slightly more reddish light. Then it turned back to yellow. When 1 in the morning came, the sun was rising again, as if nothing had happened. Watching this scene, you experienced a strange feeling. On one hand, it was mesmerizing because you were witnessing such a powerful event of nature. But on the other hand, it was disturbing because this was something the human body couldn't understand. Your brain didn't know what to do. It was past midnight. It was time to sleep, but the sun was shining. Your eyes still said daytime. There was conflict inside. Your body was receiving contradictory signals. When you returned home, it was 2 o'clock, but you couldn't sleep. You tossed and turned in bed until almost 5 in the morning. The next morning, when you went to school, most of your students looked tired. They also hadn't been able to sleep because last night was special. They had celebrated with their families, wandered the streets until late. Your 12-year-old student Sigridur had told you. Last night she went for a midnight walk with her mother. It was 1:30, but outside was bright as day. She felt very strange. Yes, very strange, you said to yourself, but didn't say it out loud, because you didn't want to upset the child. As days passed, your condition started worsening. Sleep irregularity wasn't just insomnia anymore. It had become the loss of time. You remembered eating dinner one day, but was this yesterday or today you weren't sure. You had to constantly look at the calendar. Was it Saturday or Sunday? Had a week passed or 2 weeks? Your brain had started mixing up dates because days were blending together. No night, no morning, only constant brightness. And in this brightness, time was losing its meaning. One day, or more precisely, when you learned it was the 27th of June, you were shocked because you thought it was the 24th of June. Were 3 days lost? How had this happened? When you asked Christian, he had also laughed, saying, "That's how it was here. Days flew by, weren't even noticed." But you noticed, you just couldn't control it. Your body's circadian rhythm had now collapsed because melatonin hormone wasn't being secreted regularly. Cortisol and adrenaline levels were mixed up. The sleep-wake cycle was disrupted. One evening, or around 11 o'clock, when you looked out your window, you saw children playing in the park. 3 children, 5, 6 years old, swinging on swings, sliding on slides, laughing. Their mothers sat on benches, chatting. 11 o'clock, 11 at night. But no one cared, because outside was bright. The sun was shining. The children's bedtime hadn't come yet. This scene disturbed you because the same problem existed for children, too. Their biological clocks were also being disrupted. The next day, when you asked Elisabeth, she explained, in summer months, children slept less. Families forced them to bed, but children resisted. The exact opposite happened in winter. They slept more. Your fisherman neighbor, Magnus, you saw him preparing to go out to the boat one morning at 3 o'clock. You greeted each other. He had told you nighttime was the best fishing time. The water surface was calm. Fish rose up. They always went out at night. But there was no night, only slightly less light. For Magnus, this was normal because he had lived here all his life. But you still couldn't get used to it. When you asked if they ever got tired, what it was like to work constantly, he shrugged. They got tired, but what could they do? There was work. Summer was short. They couldn't work in winter. That's why they worked more in summer. This logic was ruthless, but true. Because in winter storms, darkness, cold, all made fishing difficult. One day you had a long conversation with Gudrun. She had told you, in her first summer she lost 5 kilograms. Her body didn't know when to eat, because there was no difference between lunch and evening. She had no appetite in the mornings, stayed hungry at night, then learned. She said you had to eat by the clock, not by the sun. Eat at the same times every day, sleep at the same times, otherwise there would be chaos. She was right, but applying this was difficult, because the body reacted to the sun, not the clock. 6 o'clock could be dinner time, but your stomach wanted lunch, because outside was like noon. At the beginning of July, psychological symptoms started appearing. First came energy decline. When you got up in the mornings, you felt tired, but not just physical. This was mental fatigue. You didn't want to do anything. Your motivation had decreased. Everything seemed meaningless. Then, unwillingness began. Even while teaching students, you struggled because you couldn't concentrate. While reading a sentence, you forgot what you were saying in the middle. When students asked questions, you made extra effort to answer. Christian had noticed your condition, had asked if you were okay. You said you were fine, but you both knew the lie. Emotional imbalance also began. One day you got angry for no reason, spoke harshly to a student than normal, then regretted it. Another day you became sad for no reason, sat at home, cried without understanding why you were crying. Control of your emotions was starting to slip away because sleep deprivation, hormonal imbalance, disruption of your circadian rhythm, when all combined, psychological effects were inevitable. You knew this, but couldn't prevent it. One night, it was past 3 o'clock. You were lying in bed looking at the ceiling. Your thoughts were flowing. How much longer could you endure? If your sleep pattern didn't improve, if your mental health deteriorated, what would you do? Would you leave here? But where to? Would you return to Reykjavik? Would you accept failure? These questions were spinning in your head, but you couldn't find the answer. All you knew was that you were losing time, losing control, approaching the limits of your body and mind. And summer hadn't ended yet. You still had 4 weeks ahead. Chapter 3. Social Change and Strange Habits. When the 4th day of July came, you had begun to fully grasp how strange a rhythm life in the Safjordur had. For the townspeople, the concept of time had become flexible, fluid, almost meaningless, just as it had for you. There was no difference between 7 in the morning and midnight, because in both, the sun was shining, people were on the streets. Life continued. The supermarket was open at 2 at night, because customers were coming. The town's small cafe served coffee at 4 in the morning, because fishermen stopped by before going out. The schedule of a normal society operating by hours had collapsed here. On Saturday, meaning July 6, there was slight excitement in the town, because the Arctic Open Golf Tournament had been held in nearby Akureyri city. Christian had told you. This tournament was held at one of the world's northernmost golf courses. 36 holes over 2 days. Both amateurs and professionals could participate. That year, the tournament had taken place between June 23 and 25. But a few people who went from Isafjordur were still talking about this experience. Magnus's brother had participated in the tournament. When he returned, he had shared his experiences with everyone. They had played at 11 at night. The sun was still overhead. They could see perfectly where the ball went. Never needed artificial light. At 2 in the morning, hitting at the 9th hole, snow sparkled on the peaks of surrounding mountains. The sky was shrouded in pink gold tones. These descriptions had surprised you, because golf being played at midnight wasn't something the human brain could fully grasp. There was a small bar in the town's central square. This place, called Edinburgh, was a venue where locals gathered every evening. But since the concept of evening had disappeared, people came at midnight too. One night, when it was 1:32, passing by there, you noticed inside was full. You must have been curious because you went inside. Old men sat at tables, chatting while sipping their beers. At the counter, two women were ordering vodka. In the corner, a young couple was laughing quietly. The bartender, a middle-aged bearded man, was quickly serving customers. No one looked at the clock because the clock was now meaningless. You ordered a coffee, told the bartender how interesting it was that there were still customers at this hour. The man laughed, said they called this sun coffee. In winter, when there was no sun, no one drank coffee at night. But in summer, when there was sun, everyone drank coffee at all hours, consumed alcohol too, ate too, because bodies no longer tracked time. While working at school, you had a long conversation with Elisabeth in the teacher's lounge. She had explained to you, in summer months, the Safjordur residents' sleep durations decreased by an average of 30%. People slept less but became more active because sunlight gave energy. But this energy was false energy. The body was getting tired but didn't feel it. Then at the end of August, everyone suddenly collapsed. Elisabeth herself, last year, in the last week of August, had barely gotten up from bed for 3 days. Her body had suddenly felt all the accumulated fatigue of summer. This information had worried you because you were already very tired. So what state would you be in at the end of August? On the 8th day of July, after school closed, you decided to go to the doctor. There were only 2 doctors at the town's small health center, one old, one young. You chose the young one. His name was Sigurður. When you entered his examination room, you noticed the man looked tired. Under his eyes were bruised, his skin pale, as if he too suffered from insomnia. When he asked what was wrong, you explained your situation. You had been living in this Safjordur for 6 weeks. Your sleep pattern had completely disrupted. You slept an average of 4 or 5 hours per day. You were very tired, had attention deficit, were emotionally unbalanced. After listening, Sigurður nodded, said these symptoms were very common. In summer months, half his patients came with similar complaints: insomnia, anxiety, depressive symptoms, fatigue. Disruption of the body's circadian rhythm led to hormonal imbalance, which triggered psychological problems. Sigurður asked you several questions. How was your appetite? Had you lost weight? How was your concentration? How were your social relationships? You answered your appetite was variable. Sometimes you didn't want to eat at all. Sometimes you were very hungry. You had lost 2 kilograms. Your concentration was very poor. Your social relationships were minimal because you didn't have energy to talk with people. After taking notes, Sigurður explained. He suggested increasing the melatonin supplement, going to bed at the same time every night, using thick curtains, if possible, creating a completely dark room. He also suggested vitamin D support, because staying constantly indoors and not properly benefiting from sunlight could create problems. Most importantly, you had to create a stable routine, eat at the same time every day, exercise at the same time, sleep at the same time. Your body would learn time from habits, not from your eyes. When you left the examination room, the clock showed 3 in the afternoon, but the sun was still shining like noon. In front of the health center, an old woman sat on a bench, knitting. You sat next to her and looked at the view. The woman said something to you in Icelandic. You didn't understand. Apologized, saying you spoke English. The woman also switched to English, said her name was Christine. She was 73 years old, had lived in Ísafjörður all her life. She asked you, did you have a sleep problem? When you wondered how she knew, she laughed, Said everyone here came to the doctor in summer months. They all experienced the same problem. She said she got used to it, but it was still difficult. Winters were harder then because there was no sun. The exact opposite was experienced. People couldn't wake up, fell into depression. For 73 years she had lived this cycle. 6 months excess light, 6 months absence of light. Her body had now gotten used to it, but her psychology never got used to it. She struggled every year. When you returned home, you decided to apply Sigurður's advice. First, you tried to darken your bedroom as much as possible. You stuck black cardboard papers behind the thick curtains, covered every part of the window. The room became almost completely dark. At 11 at night, you lay in bed, closed your eyes. There was darkness, no sunlight. Your body should receive the night signal, but you couldn't sleep. You tried to understand why you couldn't sleep. Your ears still heard sounds from outside, people walking on the street, children riding bicycles, young people talking. Despite it being 11, 12, 1 o'clock, people were still outside, because outside was bright. Your brain perceived these sounds, said it wasn't night yet. Artificial darkness wasn't enough. The outside world was shouting it wasn't night. In the morning, or when the alarm rang at 7:55, you got up, opened the curtains. The sun was shining again. You had slept a total of 3.5 hours. Your artificial darkness experiment had failed. You went to the kitchen, made coffee, saw Guðrún in the garden downstairs. You called to her, explained your situation. Guðrún came upstairs, looked at your room, saw the papers, smiled. She explained to you. This method didn't work much because the problem wasn't just light. Sound, smell, air, all of them told the brain it wasn't night. Some people used sleeping pills, but this was dangerous. Could be addictive. The best method was patience. The body would adapt after 2 months. Though not perfect, it would become bearable. On the 12th day of July, Kristján invited you to dinner. His house was outside the town, a small wooden house among the hills. You arrived at 8, met his family, his wife Helga. They had 2 children, an 8-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. The meal had come to the table. Nettle soup, smoked salmon, potatoes, black bread. While eating, you chatted. Helga asked how your sleep was. Kristján must have told about your situation. You said it was bad. Helga nodded, said she too had struggled a lot the first year. It was harder for children. Their bodies were more sensitive. Their sleep patterns were more easily disrupted. Their daughter last year throughout the summer hadn't slept until midnight. It was impossible to wake her in the mornings. She was very irritable. This year was a bit better because her body had started to adapt. After the meal, you went outside, climbed the hill. Despite it being 11 o'clock, the sky was still bright. The sun had descended, but hadn't set. From the hill, you could see Ísafjörður, small, colorful houses, narrow fjord, steep mountains around. The view was breathtaking. Kristján showed you something. Described what this view looked like in winter. From mid-November to late January, the sun would stay behind the mountains. The town would be in complete shadow. There would only be dim light during noon hours. People would live with artificial light. Lamps would be on from morning to evening. No one would see natural sunlight. Then, on the 29th of January, the sun would appear for the first time over the mountains. The whole town would go outside. They would make pancakes, drink coffee. Children wouldn't go to school. Everyone would celebrate. This narrative both surprised and saddened you because living here was a constant struggle. Summer against light, winter against darkness. On the way home, it was 1:30. But the streets were still full. People were walking, talking, laughing. A group of young people was entering the cafe. An old couple sat on a bench, looking at the fjord. A little girl was trying to roller skate. Her father was holding her. 1:30. In a normal society, everyone would be sleeping. But here, no one was sleeping, because time was lost. There was no night, only an endless daytime. You also arrived home, lay in bed, closed your eyes. For 4 weeks you hadn't been able to sleep properly. Your body was tired, your mind foggy. You had lost control of your emotions. But still life continued. You had to teach, had to care for your students, had to appear normal. Could you endure? You didn't know, but you had to try because you had no other choice. Chapter 4. Crisis, Adaptation, and the First Sunset. On the 17th day of July, when the 9th week began, you realized you had now reached the point of mental and physical exhaustion. When you got up in the morning and looked at your reflection in the mirror, you couldn't recognize yourself. The color of the bruising under your eyes had darkened even more. You could see your cheeks had sunken because you had lost 4 kilograms. Your hands were trembling. Your head constantly ached. Your stomach was churning. While teaching at school, you had frozen in the middle of a sentence, forgot what you were saying. Students had looked at you. You had looked at them. For a few seconds, nothing had happened. Then you pulled yourself together, apologized, but inside, you knew something was going very wrong. The most frightening symptoms started on the 19th day of July. That morning, when you woke up, you looked out the window. The sun was shining. You looked at the clock. What time was it? Did the clock show 9 or 11? The numbers came blurry. You couldn't focus. You rubbed your eyes, looked again. 11. But was this 11 in the morning or 11 in the evening? The sun was shining, so it must be daytime. But which daytime? Did you go to bed last night, or didn't you sleep at all? Your memory was blurry. You got out of bed, went to the kitchen, looked at the calendar. July 19. Were you sure? Was yesterday July 18 or July 17? Had you skipped a day, 2 days? You didn't know. The flow of time had now completely disappeared for you. That day at school, Christian called you. He was worried. You could tell from his looks. You looked very bad. He said something to you, but you didn't understand his words, as if he was speaking from very far away. You tried to focus, tried to read his lips. What was he saying? He was saying you needed to see a psychologist. Yes, you said. Yes, you're right, I should say. Christian gave you a name, Hildur. She was the town's only psychologist. An appointment had been arranged for tomorrow. Tomorrow? When was tomorrow? If today was July 19th, would tomorrow be July 20th? Probably. You nodded, thanked him, went back to your room. You sat at your desk, put your head in your hands. You thought. Were you starting to go crazy? Was your mind collapsing? Or was this part of normal? On the 20th of July, or probably the next day, you went to Hildur's examination room. The woman was in her 40s, calm, soft-spoken. She asked you questions. You tried to answer, but sometimes words didn't come. You told her you had been in this Safjordur for 9 weeks. Your sleep pattern had collapsed. You slept 3-4 hours every night. Sometimes couldn't sleep at all. You were mixing up days. Your time perception had disappeared. Sometimes you couldn't distinguish between real and unreal. Yesterday, or was it the day before, when you looked out the window, you saw a woman walking on the street, but the woman suddenly disappeared. Was it a hallucination, or was it real? You didn't know. Hildur took notes, then explained. Your condition was symptoms of serious sleep deprivation. When the human body suffered irregular sleep for more than 4 weeks, cognitive function started disrupting. Memory, attention, perception, decision-making. Hallucinations were common, because when the brain was tired from insomnia, it couldn't draw the line between reality and imagination. Hildur suggested something to you. You shouldn't go to school for a few days, should rest at home, should try to sleep. If necessary, you could use sleeping pills. But this was a last resort. She also suggested an exercise. Every morning, when you woke up, you should write the date on a large paper, hang it on the wall, look at it throughout the day. This way your brain could track time. Before going to bed in the evening, you should write the next day's date, so when you woke in the morning you wouldn't be confused. This simple exercise might work. You agreed, thanked her, left. On the way home, walking on the street, you paused several times because you forgot where you were. Then you remembered. You're in Safjordur. You're going home, just a few more steps. That evening, Gudrun had a long conversation with you. She told you, in the past, other teachers had also experienced similar problems. Some couldn't endure, returned to Reykjavik after a few weeks. But some had endured, gotten used to it over time, were now living here for years. What would you do? Would you give up, or would you continue? You had to ask yourself this question. You said something to Gudrun. You didn't want to escape from here, but your body wasn't allowing it. What should you do? Gudrun looked sympathetically, told you to be patient. At the beginning of August, days would shorten. The sun would start setting. The body would recover. Just 2 more weeks, maybe 3. Could you endure? You had to try. From the 23rd of July onward, you started applying Hildur's advice. Every morning when you got up, you wrote the date on a large paper, hung it on the wall. It said, July 23rd, Tuesday. You looked at it throughout the day, etched it into your brain. Today is July 23, Tuesday. Before going to bed in the evening, you prepared a new paper, July 24th, Wednesday. When you woke in the morning, looking at it was your first task. This exercise had worked a bit, at least. You weren't mixing up dates anymore. But your sleep problem continued. Every night you forcibly slept, 3-4 hours. You got up tired in the mornings. You fell asleep at your desk in the afternoons. One day, Elisabeth told you something. The coping methods of the town's elderly. Since the elderly had lived this cycle for years, they had developed various strategies. Some completely abandoned sleep patterns in summer, slept whenever they felt tired, got up whenever they felt refreshed. They abandoned the 24-hour cycle and lived according to their body's natural rhythm. Some increased alcohol consumption because there was no night. This way they felt drowsy, could sleep. Some constantly did physical activity, tired their bodies. This way sleep would come. Every method had risks, but everyone was coping somehow. At the end of July, one day Christian started telling you about winter. At the beginning of November, the weather would start getting cold. Days would shorten rapidly. The sun would descend a bit more each day. On November 15th, the sun could no longer rise above the mountains. The town would go into shadow. From November 20th to January 29th, for a full 70 days, they couldn't see the sun. In the mornings at 9, there would be dim light. At noon, 12, a slightly brighter gray light. In the afternoon, at 2, it would darken again. The rest, complete darkness. People would get up at 6 in the morning, turn on lamps, have breakfast, go to work, return home at 5 in the evening, eat dinner, watch television, go to bed at 9 at night. But they would never see the sun. Children would be in darkness going to and from school. Elderly people wouldn't go outside at all. Depression cases would increase. Suicidal thoughts would become widespread. Alcohol consumption would double. Then, on January 29th, a miracle would happen. That day at 12 o'clock, the sun would appear for the first time over the mountains. Its rays would reach the town. Everyone would drop whatever they were doing, go outside. Children would be taken out of school, workers taken out of factories, elderly taken out of homes. Everyone would gather in the square, look at the sun. Some would cry, some would just smile. Then the traditional celebration would begin. Everyone would make pancakes, boil large cauldrons of coffee, set tables. They called this sun coffee. Children wouldn't go to school that day. Adults wouldn't go to work. Everyone would celebrate together. In the evening, the town would hold a ball. People would dance, sing, have fun. Because the darkest period had ended. From now on, they would see a bit more sun each day. This narrative had deeply affected you because you understood how difficult it was to live in Northern Iceland. This wasn't just a geographical place. It was a psychological challenge. Summer war against light. Winter war against darkness. People would miss winter throughout summer because a world without night was exhausting. They would miss summer throughout winter because a world without daytime was depressive. This was the dilemma. Each season gave something, but took something. There was never balance, only two extremes. When the first day of August came, you felt excited because Christian had given you good news. In the coming days, the sun would start setting. It wouldn't be complete night yet, but the sun would descend below the horizon. The sky would darken for a few hours. Even this small change was very important because your body would react to it. Melatonin secretion would begin. Sleep pattern would start recovering. When would it be? On August 5th, maybe 6th. You marked it on the calendar, waited for that day. On the 4th day of August, at 11 in the evening, you went to the fjord shore. The sun stood in the west, slightly lower than usual. You started watching. 11:30, the sun slowly descended. 12, the sun approached the horizon. 12:30, the sun kissed the horizon. 1 o'clock, the sun descended below the horizon. Darkness. Real darkness. The sky turned from blue to purple. Purple to black. Stars appeared. The moon rose. For the first time, after 90 days, for the first time, you saw a real night. Tears poured from your eyes. You didn't know why you were crying but couldn't stop. Maybe they were tears of relief, maybe tears of joy, or maybe just the reaction of an exhausted body. You looked around. You weren't alone. A few more people had come. They were also watching the sunset. An old man, a young couple, a little girl, and her mother. No one was speaking, only watching. The sun stayed below the horizon. Darkness deepened. The sky became completely black. About an hour later, around 2 o'clock, the eastern side of the sky started brightening slightly. The sun was coming back. But still, you had experienced an hour of real night. This was enough. This was enough for you. When you returned home, it was 3:30. You lay in bed, closed your eyes. Your body felt different. Your brain felt different. You had seen darkness, experienced night. Now you could sleep. And you slept. Deep, uninterrupted, real sleep. When you woke in the morning at 11, you had slept 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours. After 90 days, for the first time, you had slept 7.5 hours. Your body had rested, your head was clear, you had energy. You went to the kitchen, made coffee, saw Gudrun. She had also noticed. Said your face had changed. You looked more refreshed. The bruising under your eyes had decreased. Your skin was a bit more vibrant. On August 2nd night, the sun also set. This time it was dark for an hour and a half. Third night, 2 hours. Fourth night, 2.5 hours. Every night was getting slightly longer dark. Every night you were sleeping slightly more. Your body had started recovering. Your circadian rhythm was trying to rebuild. When the 10th day of August came, there were now 5 hours of darkness every night, and you were also sleeping 6-7 hours every night. You were returning to your normal life. Slowly, but surely. One evening, August 12th, while sitting by the fjord shore watching the sunset, the sun was slowly descending toward the horizon. The sky was shrouded in orange-red tones. Clouds had taken on pink-purple colors. The reflection of the sun sparkled on the water surface. This scene was so beautiful that you held your breath. All the difficulties, all the pain, all the despair you experienced over the last 90 days had gained meaning in this moment. Because now you understood. You understood the value of darkness only when you lived in constant brightness. You appreciated the beauty of night only when you lived a summer without night. You grasped how sensitive, how fragile, how dependent the human body was only when natural cycles were disrupted. You thought, for millions of years, humans had evolved according to the night-day cycle. This cycle wasn't just a habit, it was a need. Waking when the sun rose, sleeping when the sun set. This wasn't just a cultural behavior. It was a biological necessity. Melatonin, cortisol, serotonin. All these hormones worked according to this cycle. Heartbeat, blood pressure, body temperature, all changed according to this rhythm. But here, in Ísafjörður, this cycle didn't exist. In summer months, because there was no night, the body was confused. In winter months, because there was no daytime, the body collapsed. This wasn't a place designed for humans to live. But still, humans lived. How were they enduring? Adaptation, resilience, stubbornness. The human spirit was strong. The human body was flexible. Life found its way. On the 15th of August, school reopened. You also returned to duty. Your students had missed you. On the first day of class, you were excited because now you were better, stronger, more refreshed. You taught the lesson. Students listened, asked questions. You answered. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. At lunch, you ate with Christian and Elisabeth, thanked them. Without their support, maybe you couldn't have endured. Christian laughed. This was a path everyone went through. You had also passed it. Now you were a real Ísafjörður resident. On the 20th of August, or 5 days after school opened, you woke up early one morning. It was 6 o'clock. The sun hadn't risen yet. Outside was dark, real darkness. You looked out the window. The streets were empty. House lights were on. Mists wandered over the fjord. This scene was peaceful because it was normal, just like in the rest of the world. Morning darkness, night silence, the flow of time. Everything was in its place. You made coffee, sat at the table, drank while looking out the window. Half an hour later, the sky started brightening in the east. The sun slowly rose. A new day began. And you were happy, just happy. On the 25th of August, Gudrun told you something. In the coming weeks, the weather would get cold. Snow would start falling in mid-September. Winter would come at the end of October. The sun would disappear in mid-November. Were you ready? Were you ready to live through winter? 2 months without sun, complete darkness. You fought against light in summer. You won. You would fight against darkness in winter. Maybe you would win. Maybe you would lose. But you had to try because this was now your home. Isafjordur was now your town. These people were now your friends. You looked at Gudrun, told her, "You're ready. You'll get through winter too. You'll stay here. You'll endure." Gudrun smiled, touched your shoulder, congratulated you. Because most people couldn't get through the first summer, but you had. Now, you truly belonged here. On the last day of August, the 28th, after dinner, you walked to the fjord shore. The sun was setting. Now it set every evening at 9 o'clock. The sky was shrouded in crimson tones. Clouds were burning in flames. Colors were dancing on the water's surface. You sat on a bench, watched. You thought, 3 months ago when you came here, you were young, naive, unprepared. You knew you would live a summer where the sun didn't set, but you couldn't grasp what this meant. Now you knew. Loss of time, absence of sleep, collapse of mind, rebellion of body. You had experienced everything, but you had endured, fought, won. Now you were strong, now you were wise, now you were ready. Let winter come, let darkness come. You were here, you are here, you will stay here. Because Isafjordur had taught you something. No matter how fragile a person is, no matter how weak they become, they could stay standing. They just needed to believe, just be patient, just hope. And you believed, you were patient, you hoped. The sun set, night came, you returned home. Tomorrow a new day would begin, a new struggle, a new life. But you were ready.